Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction: Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sarah, what movie are we doing this week?
This week we will be talking about Amistad. And Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of racism, violence, slavery, death, some scenes of middle passage that are a very disturbing representation of a thing that really did happen that was horrible. Anything else you can think of?
I mean, it's a lesser charge to make of the movie, but there is quite a bit of white saviorhood in this film.
Yes, but there is also creating a composite character who isn't real in an effort to avoid white saviorism.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm speaking of the character of Mr. Joadson, played by Morgan Freeman.
This fucking movie. Rena, can you give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned.
Some of the sources used in this episode include Mutiny on the Amistad, the saga of a slave revolt and its impact on American abolition law and diplomacy by Howard Jones, John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People by Randall Woods, the podcast Totalis Rankium episodes on John Quincy Adams, the Amistad Case in Fact and Film by Eric Foner from historymatters.edu, and Screen Rant article Amistad Movie, Every Change That Was Made from the True Story to the Film.
Sarah, can you please tell us a little bit about the Amistad and the movie Amistad?
Of course. So about the boat, the Amistad was, it's Spanish for friendship, ironically enough, was a 19th century two-masted schooner owned by a Spaniard living in Cuba. It became renowned in July 1839 for a slave revolt led by captives who had been captured and sold to European slave traders and illegally transported by a Portuguese ship from West Africa to Cuba in violation of European treaties against the Atlantic slave trade. And the film Amistad, it is a 1997 American historical drama directed by Steven Spielberg based on the events that took place on the Amistad. And it follows the international legal battle that followed their capture by the Washington, a U.S. revenue cutter. And the case was ultimately resolved by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1841. Spoiler alert. Movie starred Morgan Freeman, Anthony Hopkins, and Matthew McConaughey, along with Dijmon Hounsou in his breakout role as Cinque, the slave who as Cinque, the captive who led the rebellion, Pete Postlethwaite, Nigel Hawthorne, welcome back to the show, Nigel Hawthorne, and a then unknown Chiwetel Ejiofor. The film received largely positive critical reviews and grossed over $58 million worldwide against a $39 million budget. And Rena, could you please tell us a little bit about John Quincy Adams, the reason why we chose the movie Amistad?
Yes. So there's a kind of thread running through the four films that we picked for November that Lincoln, also directed by Steven Spielberg, is sort of our ideal of a president. That LBJ is kind of, in terms of getting things done that make a positive difference for people, about the best you're going to do with a president in the real world. And John Quincy Adams, he's possibly the most brilliant president that we've had, and he's an example of this is why we can't have nice things. Next week, we will be doing Tennessee Johnson, a real garbage fire of a movie that does a hatchet job on our beloved Thaddeus Stevens. So, John Quincy Adams is an ex-president in this. Nigel Hawthorne also appears in this as Martin Van Buren, the 8th president. At the point when Amistad takes place, John Quincy Adams is unusual among ex-presidents in that he went back into government. He went back to the House of Representatives, where he was sometimes called Old Man Eloquent, and he served there until his death. And it's an interesting story. When he died in the chamber, Abraham Lincoln was in the room at the same time. So it's just torch passing. John Quincy Adams was born in 1767 and died in 1848. He spoke more languages than any other president. Just to give you an example of what he was like, I have a portion here from John Quincy Adams, A Man for the Whole People by Randall Woods, where it talks about how he became obsessed with determining the system of weights and measures. And this is sort of why I'm in love with the guy. One of the reasons that John Quincy seemed in a perpetual fog was that he was deeply engrossed in a study of weights and measures. He had delved into the subject while in Russia, but had only just begun when called to other duties. Intellectual that he was, Adams was delighted to discover while settling in at his offices at State that Congress had mandated the nation's chief diplomat to prepare a report on the weights and measures used by the various states and foreign nations and to recommend a uniform system for the United States. Most secretaries of state would have assigned the task to a clerk, but not John Quincy Adams. For him, nothing was too arcane. In truth, he was dedicated to the proposition that government could improve society by supporting scientific inquiry. Soon he was discovering how many English ounces constituted a French liter and measuring the impact that atmospheric conditions had on those measurements' use in human commerce. In the summer of 1819, he recorded in his diary, "I plunged deeper and deeper into my inquiries concerning coins, currencies, and exchange. The deeper I go, the deeper and darker appears the deep beneath. And although the want of time will soon force me to break away from the subject without even finding its bottom, yet it now fascinates and absorbs me to the neglect of most necessary business." The report upon weights and measures was submitted to Congress on February 22nd, 1821. His father, irked that John Quincy had skipped his annual vacation in Quincy to work on the report, observed wryly to Louisa that the document was a mass of historical, philosophical, chemical, metaphysical, and political knowledge that even he could not wade through. She wrote back, "Thank God we hear no more of weights and measures." And one anecdote about him that they tell on the Totalis Rankium episode about little John Quincy Adams was that he noticed that when he was 10, that both of his parents loved to read Milton. So he tried reading Milton and he could just not get the hang of it. And then he noticed that John Adams and Abigail Adams liked to read Milton while smoking a pipe. So he put himself to practice smoking that big old pipe of tobacco, and he learned to smoke, but he didn't manage to like Milton until he was 30. But note how different that passage is from Lyndon Johnson last week, threatening to kick people if they hit him.
No scissor kicks in that excerpt.
So, in addition to serving as the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams was previously the 8th United States Secretary of State. He represented Massachusetts in both chambers of Congress, and he was the eldest son of 2nd President John Adams and his wife Abigail Adams. Yeah, amazing mind. And we see some of his character in there, that he has integrity. He's also quite irascible. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, no, this movie is about the captives, but it also featured someone who I think of as, out of most of the presidents, he is in a little category called "This is why we can't have nice things." So my conclusion was that if Anthony Hopkins can win an Academy Award for Silence of the Lambs for Best Actor on a Best Supporting Actor's amount of screen time, then his performance several years later as John Quincy Adams can get mentioned as a theme within our presidential month, despite it not being a biopic about John Quincy Adams.
I would say that the John Quincy Adams of this is the least problems I have of this movie, which is terrible English, but I had a lot of problems with this movie.
The biggest problem with it is that I see the touch of Spielberg, and it's not as good as Lincoln.
It is not. This period of Spielberg is really strange. This is right after he and Geffen and Katzenberg launched DreamWorks. It feels a little bit like he was phoning it in on a couple of projects. This one and Jurassic Park: The Lost World both feel a little bit like autopilot, and this feels like prestige autopilot. Like it, the only real Spielbergian hallmarks to it, to me, are the John Williams score and the deeply sentimental take of finding like the one story where things didn't turn out nightmarishly horrible for slaves, or rather captive people who were being brought to this country to serve as slaves. Like the one time that they were not put into the service of this country and cotton and whatever else, tobacco. So it feels kind of like the slavery Schindler's List in terms of like the fact that he's taken like the one story that could be found about something extraordinary happening and found a way to make that the story. And he finds that one kind of uplifting story and uses it as a way to show how horrible things were. Like it's almost like a sneak attack to see what happens in the middle passage in this movie.
I had looked on this from the angle of before Lincoln, same production values, not as good. I hadn't thought at all about the angle of let's tell this story from the point of view of the one group of a group of people who got slightly lucky and survived. And not even that, because all like the evidence is that Cinque never found his wife and children.
These were the few among the many millions of people dragged across the ocean out of their homes to work for white people who got to go back, kind of, but things were still horrible for them. I did think that the middle passage portion of this was incredibly effective. However, it was surrounded by the rest of this movie, which is tonally all over the lot. You know, there's like some humor in it that's a little weird. It kind of lacks a sort of focus because JQA is in this, but he really doesn't come to be a part of this until the last 30 minutes. It's such a strange entry into the Spielberg canon because it is bookended on either side dramatically by Schindler's List, which I'm not going to debate anyone on the goodness of that movie. It's an incredibly powerful piece of filmmaking. And then also Saving Private Ryan is on the other side of this. This is just kind of there, like in this sort of like bucket of like Always and Ready Player One and movies where you're like, huh, so that exists. Okay. I'm going to forget that I saw Amistad in about 4 weeks.
In terms of like the mishmash of storytelling, there's this other story that, for me, that was going on with John Quincy Adams where he sort of follows that Joseph Campbell line of turning down the hero's journey twice and then takes it on, and it's his reckoning with the legacy of his own father as a founder of the nation, because you see that scene where he moves in front of the bust of John Adams, and that reminded me of how your parent is always your parent, like even when they're gone, but also if they're like 95 and you're 70, but it's one of a number of threads. And we talked about how there is white saviorism, but then they create a composite character played by Morgan Freeman, who's sort of meant to stand in for a lot of things. We open on Cinque pulling a very ratchet-looking nail peg thing out of some very splintery-looking wood to free everyone. And I guess my immediate problem was the use of subtitles is all over the place. When they don't start letting you know what the captives are saying until a quarter of the way into the movie, it makes the captives feel othered when that is the opposite of what they want to be doing. And I was thinking, is this a misjudgment meant to capture their own alienation from when they don't know what anyone's saying? Because the problem with it is that if you can understand what all the white people are saying and you can't understand what the protagonists are saying, it creates a separation and it's confusing.
The use of subtitles is capricious, and the movie doesn't give you a lot of ways in to try and interpret what's going on. And not only does it other the characters, but it also, outside of Cinque, makes the rest of the men standing trial sort of interchangeable. You know, there's nothing defining them from each other and as characters. Like, a friend of mine recently sent me an album cover to a Chipmunks ripoff album that was made in the 80s. And the characters were defined by one had on like a ski hat and one had earphones and one had a bow. And that's kind of how this feels. None of these characters mean anything except they crack wise sometimes, which feels really tonally weird.
Mm-hmm. Well, people in bad situations use gallows humor to feel better among themselves.
Yeah, it feels like their gallows humor is very informed by American ideas, though, too. Like, where I would speculate that in a different draft of this screenplay, Morgan Freeman's character was a white man. Because there's absolutely nothing except like one or two pieces of lip service that even defines him as a freed slave.
We'll get to this. So they have their rebellion on the boat. There's a lot of blood. And then they think that the Spanish captain is steering them back to Africa. But what he was doing was he was sailing toward the sun by day and then turning the ship the other direction by night. And when they see land, it is very quickly apparent this is not Africa. There's ice over the water, and they see a dude on a bicycle, which they've never seen before. And they are captured and brought into court. And this first court scene is incredibly confusing. I thought, well, is this a way of emphasizing how confusing it is for the captives? Or is it just a mess?
A little bit of both, because what I did appreciate was there's some really good moments in this movie. And one of them is, I think, that you really, at certain points, get sort of a sense of how freaking chaotic and confusing this must have been for these captives. They're dragged onto a boat. They're all chained together. They're tortured. Then they show up here in America, and there's several different parties of people trying to claim them. They're being brought to court. They're being, brought to jail. You get the chaos of that. And I thought that that was actually really an interesting sequence in the court scene. Everyone's kind of like trying to lay claim to them. And like, I think that one of the things that, also I didn't love about the opening too was this is all happening at night. Like, if we can invent whole characters, we don't have to show this uprising happening in pitch black, so we can't even really tell what's going on. And I was like, you know what? Good for you guys. This should have happened all the time. And it's too bad it didn't happen more often. Because like the slave trade is disgusting. And I think one of the other things this film underlines is like how freaking feckless every leader was in that 25-year period in the run up to the Civil War, where they're all just like, do not let me get caught with the hot potato of having to deal with the war breaking out. What do I have to do to kick this can down the road? And you see that set up pretty well with the Martin Van Buren enter into it. Baby Queen Isabella II, who's 11. Somehow, like, little baby Anna Paquin reminds me of you. I don't know why. It could be like cadence of speech. I think like you have similar facial structure and dark hair. I don't know what it was, but I'm watching this and I'm like, she reminds me so much of Rena. And that's a really weird thing to say because you do seem like a fully grown adult.
So the way that they have her dressed as the 11-year-old Spanish queen, this is absolutely how I would dress if life gave me occasion for it. I would absolutely live in 19th century cosplay if there were any reason to.
I can't explain it. It was just a vibes thing.
That we have a formal manner of speech?
Maybe? But I mean, she also looks like you in this. I don't know how to explain it, like without it sounding really weird, because you don't look like an 11-year-old girl. But
no, and I, alas, do not rule a nation via inheritance. And fortunately, I have never done anything to make or keep slavery real.
Not to get into like life details or anything, knowing what I know of your parentage, they don't seem like people who would be real happy with you jumping on a bed with an expensive doll either, which we do see her do at a certain point in this film.
I did love to jump on the bed like every other child, and I was warned off of it like every other child that happens to have responsible parents. So I could certainly see myself doing that in similar garb with an expensive toy and enjoying it. But it isn't something I currently do.
I don't see that. I don't know how to explain it, but it amused me.
That's great. I'll take it as a compliment.
I mean, I think it is a compliment. She's very lovely in this movie.
But beautifully garbed little Queen Isabella II of Spain is, through her advisors, a defender of slavery, and she wants those slaves back. As a kid, and when we first see her, she's doing this little kid thing where she's like holding a knife and like doing tricks where she's like peering at her eye in it.
Because she's a child.
Yes, and she is queen because her father is dead. So where were we? So Matthew McConaughey comes in here somewhere to take the job as the lawyer. And one little touch that I loved was that the first time that the captives see him, some of them are watching him and they're saying, yeah, this guy reminds us of this dung scraper we used to know. And I thought that was funny because it was sort of a comment on how lawyers are like the highest people. And I thought it was funny. They're saying, oh yeah, this guy reminds us of the dung scraper. So the real Roger S. Baldwin was a grandson of Roger Sherman, the Declaration signer from Connecticut, who will show up in 1776. So in addition to our running tally of actors we've seen in multiple films and characters we've seen portrayed by multiple people, there will also be children of characters portrayed by people who are related that we'll see popping up. We're probably going to we may run into some of Isabella's ancestors at some point.
This was like when the first wave of McConaughey started. He's a star in this, but he's not great. Like at one point he says, I'm from Philadelphia, y'all. And it's like, oh, you got cast for your looks, didn't you? He has no northern bearing whatsoever in this.
So I enjoyed watching him, though. a lot. I enjoyed his delivery, but yes, Matthew McConaughey is Texas.
Yeah.
And
As I said,
when I think of Texas in a positive light, which rarely happens, I think of Matthew McConaughey. And there's this moment later in the film where he's expressing joy and he does this like yow jump where it's like, no, that is hoedown. That is Texas. I thought he did an okay job fixing the accent most of the time. Okay.
he was breaking through as a big star. At this point, like he became a star before he became a good actor. Like he's he's great and dazed and confused and everything, and they didn't know what to do with him for a little bit, where he was like making rom-coms with like Sarah Jessica Parker and things like that before he kind of figured out who he wanted to be as an actor. And this feels like a role that Tom Cruise would have played 10 years prior.
So he arrives and he sells them on him as the attorney, and he's making his argument to Joadson, the composite, not real character played by Morgan Freeman, and to Mr. Tappan, played by Stellan Skasgard, who I always think of as Eric Solveig from the Marvel films. So the abolitionists want it to be about freedom, and he says, well, no, this is an issue of property. So I actually thought all the actors did a great job, especially Dijmon Hounsou and Chiwetel Ejiofor. There's a sequence that, of course, this went down differently in real life, where they're trying to figure out where the captives are from. So they bring in a linguist named Dr. Gibbs, who is completely winging it and has no idea what they're saying. Oh, we finally get some subtitles, and it's meant to be some kind of comedy of like crossed wires confusion, but I don't think it's handled all that well. And Spielberg did an up to his usual level job of getting performances from the actors, but the material and the construction of it and the solutions that they found to things didn't quite work.
Do you want to hear how the casting of this film could have been worse?
Tell me how the casting of this film could have been worse.
Cuba Gooding Jr. was offered the role of Cinque.
No, that would have been bad.
Uh-huh.
Dijmon Hounsou is so good in this, and he has so much like dignity and conflict. And actually, one moment that I really loved was when they figure out how to talk in Mende. I mean, they figure out a few words in Mende, and then they say, okay, go around the market to places where there are people who may be from Africa and see if you can get a reaction. And Chiwetel Ejiofor overhears, and he's playing a young man who was taken by slavers and then freed by the British Navy and wound up in the British Navy. And there's this look of wonder on his face where he hears words of his language, and you get this, of course, it must be the loneliest thing in the world to have not heard your own language for years and years and years. And then you see that Morgan Freeman and Stellan Skarsgård take him into a pub, and they're explaining excitedly to him what they need.
That was a great moment. And he's wonderful in this movie. You can tell he's gonna be a star. And Dijmon Hounsou like submitted a tape that eventually got to Spielberg. Like it's a real stars, like a real breakthrough moment for him. My piece of trivia on him is that I remember him playing a bouncer in the pilot episode of Beverly Hills 90210. And to see him in this, he's really like, he's so wonderful, and he's so perfect for the part and looks right and has this evocative face, and you're thinking like, you were gonna cast Cuba Gooding Jr. in this, really? Also, Will Smith wanted the part.
He's a big star, but he's not right for it.
No, he's not. He wouldn't have been right. I'm very glad that things worked out the way they did with this movie, casting wise, because I Will Smith would have been very distracting. Because Will Smith is never not Will Smith. But nevertheless, it all worked out okay. They're kind of trying to figure out the court case, and they also go and approach John Quincy Adams initially, and he's all, you know what? No, thank you. But good luck with your case. We also see them doing some pretty good investigative work where they figure out that the Amistad, the original load of the original bill of lading, if you will, sources them from an illegal slave trade. Which is a great piece of information for them because it can prove that technically these men shouldn't even be captured in the first place. We also meet here the feckless Martin Van Buren, who, I don't know, was he not a particularly bright president? I don't know much about him.
He is not well remembered as a president. He eventually loses to William Henry Harrison in the election of 1840. I'd note that the final Supreme Court judgment came down in 1841, so Van Buren had lost already by the time that JQA argues for them at the Supreme Court. He was the last president before Pappy Bush to become president after sitting for 8 years as vice president.
This is a long-ass time to be in office.
We have no idea how much time is passing.
Yeah. At no point do they help us out with the timeline.
We know, and actually the incident with the boat was in 1839. The Supreme Court judgment came down in 1841. We have no idea that 2 years are passing. The only thing to tell us this is knowing that it takes a really long time for a case to make its way to the Supreme Court, which is a matter of practical knowledge.
Nevertheless, they find this manifest that proves that they have been taken illegally and brought to the United States illegally, and they're going to probably win the case. And Van Buren, he replaces the judge on the case with a much younger, much less experienced judge who is played by Jeremy Northam.
Jeremy Northam is very handsome here, I thought.
He is. He's also, we find out he's a Catholic and he's deeply ashamed of it. Because that's how it was back in the day. They basically have to kind of start over. Cinque is getting a real good sense for the slow grinding mechanism of the American legal system, which I'm sure is just exactly how anyone should be introduced to America.
His introduction to America was having to break ice to get water and seeing someone on a bike where they were using their feet to move the bicycle over the ground, which, yeah, early efforts at the bicycle are quite amusing.
Not the most effective way to ride a bike. During this sequence, we get to experience the Middle Passage, and it's testified to at trial, and it's grotesque.
Mm-hmm.
There's so few things that shock me anymore, but like watching people be thrown overboard because they needed more room and they were eating too much food by existing was shocking to me. Just the barbarism and the refusal to treat people as human beings deserving of dignity and life.
It's great here. Yeah. There are a total of 3 trials that we see over the course of the film. And the second one is the one where you get the big jubilation scene and you hear Cinque saying, "Give us free." Like, he finally puts that together. And that is the moment where Catholic judge Jeremy Northam says that he says, no, these men are clearly from Africa, not Cuba. They were illegally taken, and they all think they've won. They go, and Matthew McConaughey does this like kick that looks like Texas hoedown, and they did not manage to completely iron Texas out of Matthew McConaughey here. I liked the character, but it was hard for me to buy him as a Connecticut proto-preppy, because that's what these guys are.
Yeah. Yeah, like he doesn't even seem acquainted with the idea that Connecticut exists. And, and we're all cheering and it feels great and they're going to get freedom and everything. And then you look at the time and you're like, oh, we're an hour and a half into this 2.5-hour movie. God help me. We've also seen scant little of Anthony Hopkins at this point, and I'm going, where's the John Quincy Adams? But then we get just like one super duper effective scene where one of history's great villains, John Calhoun, shows up. And this is a great little performance by a great character actor, Arliss Howard, who's always happy to take up the cause of playing a monster.
Oh my God, his Calhoun was so hateable, and Calhoun he is one of our great villains. In the spirit of that every actor is their character's lawyer, he came across as someone with a point of view and a brain who regards themselves inwardly as a person with a soul worthy of recognition and respect. It was 3 dimensions of villain. I still remember the first time I saw that photograph of John C. Calhoun as an old man, and I thought, and I still think, no human has ever looked more like an angry chicken.
Yes, that's a good call out. I'm like, oh my God, here's Arliss Howard to be incredibly creepy and effective with minimal screen time, and he does it here. And this engagement here causes Van Buren to say, JK, this trial result is overturned. And McConaughey again gets to go explain the beauty of the American legal system to Cinque and to the other captives, and it goes over real well, as you would expect.
Yes, you see that moment from the trailer where Dijmon Hounsou yells, and he's beautifully silhouetted in a dark evening with like candle and firelight behind him. What kind of a nation is this where your laws are not laws? And it's, well, we have a system of appeal, separation of power. Also, it's 1840, and you're not a white man, so your life sucks.
Yeah, it's like, oh, honey, you have no idea how great it is to live in this country and be a part of our multi-tier legal system that does nice things for some people and mean things for other people. It's the best here. You need to get out as soon as you can. But yeah, it's fun to watch him attempt to explain it. And also, it turns out that Cinque doesn't have a word for should, which is kind of amazing because you see Chiwetel Ejiofor trying to explain should to him. And I was like, stick around in America and should is all there is. But then re-enter the gladiator, that is Anthony Hopkins, who has been appealed to by McConaughey and Morgan Freeman to come and defend these men at the Supreme Court. I just have the note, goddamn, Anthony Hopkins is the best at this. Because like, as I said, there's not enough Anthony Hopkins in this up until like the last 20 minutes of it. And then it is just the Anthony Hopkins show. You watch him, plead the case, and you see this like beautiful journey, like as you mentioned, him like kind of like coping with the idea that his father was one of the founders of this country and was a brilliant man, and that it's a struggle to live in that shadow and to cope with that legacy. And you see him doing that and talking about, and it's like it's so wonderful on like a couple of levels, like because you get to watch Anthony Hopkins do this, and then you're looking around in the scene and seeing all the actors in the background also getting to watch Anthony Hopkins do this.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone seems like enthralled as actors and then also enthralled as the characters, because it is wonderful to watch.
So IRL, this defense that JQA made went on for like hours and hours and hours, and we're not going to see the whole thing. Also, a number of those Supreme Court justices who ruled for the Amistad would rule against Dred Scott in the 1850s. There's also these things you see where they're talking about Mr. Smithson left us his junk, and it's like, okay, this is some cute foreshadowing where you're making the point that it's going to be the Smithsonian, isn't it? And that's how we met JQA. But one touch that I liked here in terms of the comments on lawyer is that you sort of see Cinque starting to think like a lawyer, where he sends all these questions via Shoadel Ejiofor about, well, what is this law? What is that law? Are there treaties? And he's asking like decent legal questions about this, and JQA is kind of annoyed. But yeah. I thought, isn't this funny? He's picked up a skill he never asked for of learning to think like a lawyer.
Yeah, that was really enjoyable to watch him, like to see him being like, yeah, like what about this? Do we have a treaty with this country? Does this country have a treaty with this country? And yeah, it's convincing, and he sells them on it, and they set them free and let them go home. And they are finally allowed to leave, and they go home, and we find out that Cinque's whole family is gone because there is civil war. And
that his wife and children, who he never found, may have been sold into slavery as well. And we see those nice British officers from the beginning blowing up Lomboko Fortress, and then saying, oh, make a note, it in fact doesn't exist, and they've freed the slaves. But note, Lomboko Fortress was not destroyed until 10 years after the Amistad was taken. I guess it gives Spielberg a way of tacking on a redemptive ending. It's that same trick that he did by cutting back to the big Lincoln speech from the assassination. He does this a bunch. So there's that sour note on what happened to Cinque's family, but so of course he throws in a fort being blown up, which is, it's nice to get some pyrotechnics in here.
Yeah, and it's good to see that fort get blown up.
There was jubilation after that second court judgment where you realize there's too much time left in this movie, and then after the Supreme Court one, it's more of like a calm hallelujah. And is that our movie, Sarah?
Yeah, that's our movie. I struggled my way through this. It's funny because I did expect this to be like, I had expected Lincoln to be more of an eat your vegetables movie, but this very much was. I don't know how to explain this science-wise, not unlike I don't know how to explain why you remind me of an 11-year-old queen. But it feels like this is a movie that is a photocopy of Lincoln. Or it's like prep for Lincoln, like where he's like, I'm not ready to confront the ideas that I need to confront in order to make Lincoln. So I'm going to make this.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that is like evidence of the maturation of an artist. And then also like Spielberg to me is someone whose work was deeply affected by 9/11, because if you look at his output following that event versus prior to it, it's almost like his whole worldview got shook up, and his like sentimentality got shook up by that, because he then came out with War of the Worlds and Munich and then Lincoln, and these are movies that dealt with the gray area of these like incredibly problematic things, be it alien invasion or slavery or retribution, what have you. And he seemed like, as an artist, that he got more comfortable with sitting in that discomfort in a way this movie cannot and doesn't, and is like very much like it's a movie that is like a rat in a maze looking for a positive ending and looking for the good. This is America's original sin. There's not a lot of good that can be found in that. There's not a lot of sentimentality and warm fuzzy stories that can be found in that. And it's like, this is not a feel-good topic, and we're trying all over the place to find it. Like, whether it's like these weird pockets of humor where they're making fun of like the religious people who are singing outside of the jail, or what have you. And it's just, yeah, it's a movie that's topic is not facile, and this movie is desperately seeking a way to make something positive happen out of it.
So did you is there awards talk this week?
So it was nominated for 4 Oscars.
Mm-hmm.
It was nominated for original score by John Williams. Anthony Hopkins was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, which was well earned. Cinematography, Janusz Kaminski, who works with Spielberg all the time, and then Ruth Carter for costume design. But it didn't win any of those. And then 1998 Academy Awards. Geez, that was the year of Titanic.
Of course. That's why I didn't see this at the time. Well, you saw Titanic, then you saw Good Will Hunting the following weekend, and then you were out of allowance money.
Yeah, pretty much. I will say, though, that, Hopkins didn't win that Oscar, but Robin Williams did, which was a good choice. He's wonderful in that movie.
He's already in his phase of Robin Williams taking whatever was offered to him to avoid dealing with bipolarity.
He breaks my heart. He makes me so sad. What a brilliant man. But yeah, this was a rough time in film here because of the Titanic of it all. And also like Good Will Hunting. I have nothing to say about this movie. It's just like, there's so much mediocrity.
The boats look great. The costumes look great. All the little touches of big production are well done. It's just that Spielberg is in a rough draft for Lincoln and doesn't know it yet.
Like, you could tell me anybody made this movie besides him, and I'd believe you. If you were like, James Mangold made this movie, or Alan Parker, or what's his face, Taylor Hackford, you could tell me like any of them made this movie, and I'd be like, yeah, it's a good movie for them. But like Spielberg, I'm like, I'm disappointed in you.
He still gets performances out of people.
Oh, absolutely. Like it's a fine enough movie if it weren't directed by Spielberg. But because
his storytelling is off,
it doesn't come together, and it's a very rambly movie. Like it's almost like it's one of those movies like what we've seen in other movies. Like I'm thinking of Pancho Villa right now, just for no reason whatsoever, except for the fact that there was an adherence to the truth in Pancho Villa, and this has some like adherence to the truth in it that makes the storytelling not great because it's real life stuff.
But then it diverts from the truth in ways that undermine it. So I did, despite all the many flaws that we're finding, I did have some choice dialogue for this. Did you?
I didn't, nothing grabbed me, but you go.
So the things that grabbed me were, I actually have about 5 lines written down. And at least a couple of them are from that first pitch scene with where they're auditioning Matthew McConaughey as the lawyer. First, but Christ lost. In order to do a better job than the attorney who represented the Son of God, I'll require $2.50 a day. This case is about knowing the difference between here and there. And then 2 from my man JQA. In a courtroom, whoever tells the best story wins. As a former mock trial person, I'm sure you're aware of this, Sarah. And finally, find yourself someone whose inspiration blossoms the more you lose. Okay, with that, shall we rate this thing?
Okay, so we rate movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but especially tailored to the specific issues particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes.
Yes. And I always forget this bit. I'd also highly recommend listening to our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?, where we give a rundown of the methodology, why it matters to us, and some of the inspirations behind the podcast.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
So, outward appearances, and this is me going back and saying, because I score off the gut, this is me going back and saying I was too nice because it's Spielberg. I gave it a 10, but they do a good job making Hopkins look like the portraits. They get the bad 19th century facial hair down. I did hope that they would get a Calhoun who bore a greater resemblance to an angry chicken, but you can't, especially when someone is so far out of living memory. I have to have some generosity around that most audiences aren't going to be as hung up on that particular type of authenticity as I am. But the weird 19th century facial hair was on point. 10.
I gave it an 8. I also agreed that people looked good, looked right. So, what about acting and casting?
I gave it a 9.5 because I thought all the actors were really good. Spielberg gets good performances out of people. They were well cast, and the 0.5 deduction was for even Spielberg cannot get all the Texas out of Matthew McConaughey.
Utterly impossible task. I give it a 7. I thought, the acting was good, and sure, they captured people fine.
Okay. Passage of time, I gave it a 5. I knew it wasn't that much time passing overall, but I had nothing but circumstantial evidence to tell me anything about how much time was passing. And then it also looks like the British blow up this fort like next week.
Yeah, I gave it a 4 for passage of time, same reasons. Costuming, I gave it an 8.
I gave it a 10. I think Ruthie Carter is one of the best. I love the 19th century and earlier in these things. I thought the dress Anna Paquin wore was exquisite. The frock coats they had on were exquisite things. Things were the proper level of worn in for the societal level of the character that they were playing. And Ruth Carter has also worked with she did the costumes for Malcolm X. She has also worked, aside from Spike Lee, she's worked with John Singleton and Ryan Coogler. So far as I can tell, it's her only major venture into the 19th century.
Yeah, we've seen her have a lot more fun with costumes than she got to have on this. But she is excellent.
This was her taking costume drama on her resume.
Yeah, getting that done. Um, quality of the script, I gave it a 6.
I gave it an 8. I don't know why I'm being the nice one this week.
There were a lot of good words in it. The pace was a nightmare.
Yeah, you're right. I was too generous, and I'm glad that I have you to balance me on this. For accuracy, I gave it a 3.5.
Yeah, I gave it a 5.
For storytelling, I gave it a 6. Because of the things that I cited, that just the ways that it was a mess. For production value, I gave it a 10. The things that are things look like the things that they are supposed to be. And it's really expensive to do that when you're operating 100 years ago or like.
Yeah, I gave it, I don't know why I was so mean. I gave it a 5.
Not the biggest split we've ever had. The word that I'm looking for that I feel terrible using for Amistad is ponderous.
It's true, though.
For production, direction, decision making, I gave it a 7 to balance good acting with soggy storytelling.
Same.
By being scared to use subtitles. For Do We Care, I gave it an 8 because, how can I not care about people who've been enslaved against their will? Is anyone willingly enslaved? I don't think so.
I gave it a 6. I did very much care about the captives in this. This feels like such a Pyrrhic victory, and it's hard to get excited about it because I know that there's 20 more years of slavery and 20 more years of passing the buck and Dred Scott.
The judges are not won over to the cause of abolition. They rule because of it's not about freedom, it's about legal technicality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my average came to 7.7.
Mine came to 6.1.
The average comes to 6.9. I'm sorry. Amistad, you did not earn a second opinion.
You are a perfectly acceptable motion picture.
Yes, you are a perfectly acceptable, above average motion picture made by Steven Spielberg in an off year. So, Sarah, is there anything that you'd recommend that people watch instead of Amistad?
I mean, if you're looking for Anthony Hopkins, I would strongly recommend Silence of the Lambs, his Oscar-winning movie. There's nothing that Anthony Hopkins hasn't been amazing in. And he is amazing here. He's a tremendous performer. I'm going to just re-recommend everybody watch Lincoln. That's a better movie by Spielberg. I would also, recommend anything from that post 9/11 era of Spielberg, of War of the Worlds, Munich, and then Lincoln, of movies where he's a lot more comfortable making the audience uncomfortable and asking hard questions and not giving you an answer to them. And I don't know what a good movie is about the experience of slavery in this country, but I would say that it would probably behoove us to stop making so many movies about slavery that are made by white dudes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that the definitive film about that experience has been made. Do we need to see slavery through the perspective of a couple of white dudes who tried to do the right thing one time? No. That's a good movie about being a Black person in America. Do the Right Thing. I would also recommend Do the Right Thing.
I was just going to say Lincoln because we just watched it 2 weeks ago, and
yes.
It feels like Amistad is a dress rehearsal for Lincoln.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really thinking about my list of what else to watch. So, with that, Sarah, can you take us out?
Of course, I'd be happy to. If you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is @biopicapodcaststory. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. And if you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Tennessee Johnson.
Screw that guy.
We need to get intro and outro music.